Really happy to have, coming from the UK today, Wendy Moore, a freelance journalist, author of 5 nonfiction books on medical and social history. And also, as she will tell you, this is not her first trek to New England or to the Cape. I'll let her explain. But would you welcome our guest today? And it's not her fault that she brought perfect weather. Would you welcome Wendy Moore?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Mark. So just bear with me 1 minute while I set up my PowerPoint. Okay. Right, there we go. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's really lovely to be joining you in Cape Cod. And I obviously very much wish I could be there with you in the flesh. As Mark said, I've got very fond memories of visiting Cape Cod. We have relatives who live in Maine and various points in New England. And in particular, we have relatives who live in Mashpee. So I have very happy memories of a lovely summer holiday there. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about the story of the pioneering women doctors who set up and ran a military hospital in London in the First World War. And then I'm happy to take questions. We are all living through extraordinary times at the moment. And I think that the story I'm going to talk about has got many parallels for us today. As Mark said, I'm a journalist by training, and I've written mainly about medical care. And I've written 5 non-fiction books, and they all tell stories from history. So what I look for is a remarkable story that I can tell in a kind of fast-moving way. And often when I talk, people want to know, how did I come across the stories that I write about? And usually the answer is quite dull. There's not any big eureka moment. But with this book, with No Man's Land, there really was a dramatic moment of discovery. A few years ago, I walked into a library. It was actually the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine in London, if anyone knows it. And I saw a painting on the wall, and it's this painting. And I did a double take. It's an absolutely fabulous, huge and beautiful painting. But also it's rare enough even today to see an operating room where all the doctors are female. Currently in the UK, women make up 48% of doctors, so we're almost at that tipping point. In America, it's still only 36% of doctors are female. But even within those figures, women are underrepresented in many areas of medicine, including surgery. In America, 78% of surgeons are male. In Britain, it's actually 88% of surgeons are male. And then I discovered that this picture depicts an operating room in the First World War in a military hospital that was run and staffed almost entirely by women. Endell Street Military Hospital. So I was amazed the hospital wasn't better known, and decided that I wanted to tell that story and bring it to life. Endell Street was unique. It was the only military hospital under the auspices of the British Army to be run and staffed by women. It was set up by 2 women doctors, and all of its medical staff were female. And throughout the First World War, the women at Endell Street treated wounded men sent back from the Western Front, from Gallipoli, from every war zone in the war. And the story of how the hospital came about is, I think, a remarkable example of courage and stamina and dedication that I think still speaks volumes to us today. Well, when the First World War began in August 1914, thousands of men in Britain and in Commonwealth countries, including Canada, Australia and India, signed up to fight. And women in Britain signed up in their thousands too, as volunteers in every capacity. Women worked on the land, in factories, and on public transport, like this conductorette, as she was called in London. And naturally enough, women doctors volunteered too. Within 10 days of war being declared, more than 60 women doctors in the UK put their names forward to the War Office. But their help was not wanted. They were bluntly rejected. One doctor, a Scottish surgeon, volunteered her services to the army, and she was told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were not the kind of women to sit still. They were both qualified doctors with more than 10 years experience each. Louisa, who was 41 at the outbreak of the war, was a surgeon. Flora, who was 4 years older, was a physician and anaesthetist. They both trained at the London School of Medicine for Women. But Louisa had also come to America for postgraduate training. So she attended lectures by William Osler at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and by Nicholas Sen, who was a military surgeon at Rush Medical College in Chicago. And yet, despite the fact that their qualifications were identical to their male colleagues, as women doctors, they were only allowed to treat women and children. So women in the UK had won the right to qualify in medicine several decades earlier. And in fact, it was Louisa's mother, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who was the first woman in Britain to qualify to join the medical register in 1865. Before her, another woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, who was a British woman who actually grew up in America, had gained a medical degree from Geneva Medical College in New York State. And so Blackwell was the first woman doctor in the USA. It's actually her 200th birthday this year. And she had become the first woman to put her name onto the UK register. But British medical authorities then changed the rules so that foreign medical qualifications were no longer accepted. But nearly 50 years after these women breached the barriers to medicine at the start of the First World War, women doctors in Britain and in America and Australia and Canada were still confined to treating women and children. Well, by this point, there were roughly 1,000 women doctors in Britain, and the vast majority of them had qualified, like Flora and Louisa, at the London School of Medicine for Women, for the simple reason that most medical schools, in fact, all of those in London, did not admit women students. Women were effectively barred from posts in mainstream hospitals because the boards always gave the jobs to men. It was taboo for women doctors to treat male patients, even though, of course, nurses cared for men all the time, and women rarely worked in surgery. So Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson had no choice but to work in hospitals run by women to treat women and children. Louisa worked as a surgeon at the New Hospital for Women in London, which had actually been founded by her mother. Flora also worked in small hospitals treating women and children. And together they ran a small hospital for children, only 7 beds, in a poor part of London. And that's Flora in the middle of that photograph in a very crowded outpatients department. Well, given the prejudice that they faced, it's not surprising they had both become suffragettes. They were committed to obtaining votes for women. Louisa actually served 4 weeks in prison for smashing a window in a mass demonstration. That's her on the right in the photograph, actually walking with her mother. And Flora took even more daring action. She had been Emmeline Pankhurst's doctor, the leader of the suffragettes, and campaigned vociferously against the force feeding of suffragettes who were on hunger strike in prison. And she treated many suffragettes for the ill effects of force feeding. and even actually helped some of them to evade being recaptured by the police in some quite daring escape escapades. In fact, in early 1914, she was under police surveillance for her activities. So both of them had really put their professional reputations on the line. And they were also life partners. Flora and Louisa were completely devoted to each other. They wore identical diamond rings, and they lived together in the manner of a married couple. So they stood shoulder to shoulder in the women's battle for equality. But when the war broke out, the suffragettes suspended their campaign for the vote in order to join the fight against the common enemy. So Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were just as keen as any male doctor to serve their country and to treat the wounded, but they also saw that war was an opportunity. It was a chance to gain the vital medical experience that they had been so far denied, and most importantly, to prove that women doctors were just as capable as their male colleagues. So they didn't waste time approaching the British Army. They knew they would be rejected. Instead, just 8 days after the outbreak of the war, they offered their help to the French Red Cross, who were more than happy to accept. And within a fortnight, they had raised £2,000 for medical supplies, recruited a team of like-minded women, and kitted them all out with military-style uniforms. And then on the 15th of September, just 6 weeks after the start of the war, they set off with their team for France. So they were the first women's medical unit to go abroad in the war. So they named their unit the Women's Hospital Corps. And in addition to Murray and Anderson, the Corps comprised 3 women doctors, and 2 more joined them later, 8 nurses, and more nurses also came out later, and 3 women orderlies, plus 4 male nurses who were helping with heavy work. And when they arrived in Paris, they were given an empty luxury hotel, the Hotel Claridge in the Champs-Élysées. It was brand new, it had never yet opened, and within 48 hours, they had scrubbed the floors, set up camp beds, and converted the hotel into a 100-bed emergency hospital. So they turned the hotel's stylish salons and dining rooms into wards. The ladies' cloakroom was converted into their operating room, and the grill room, which had been designed for wealthy guests to linger over steak and claret, that became their mortuary. And just 2 days after they moved into Claridge's, the wounded began pouring in. They were British and French soldiers from the front line, which was roughly 60 miles from Paris. Most of them needed urgent surgery. And as women doctors, they were, of course, extremely, even dangerously inexperienced. They had no experience of military surgery, very little experience of major surgery at all, and they'd never previously treated men. But they learned fast, and in any case, the wounds and conditions that they now faced were unprecedented. So no doctor, male or female, had previously encountered the scale of casualties and the extent of wounds that the First World War unleashed. So the men came to them with huge, gaping, ragged wounds, with complex compound fractures where the bone breaks through the flesh. There were wounds from shrapnel, which left dozens of fragments in bone and flesh, and many head injuries before the War Office, the army, eventually realised that it might be quite a useful idea if the men wore steel helmets. And even worse, most of the wounds had extensive gangrene, which had been caused by the microbes in the heavily manured French farm soil. And some patients were already showing signs of shell shock. So the wounds were a challenge for all doctors, and medical care was primitive. Blood transfusion was only just beginning to be used, wasn't available, couldn't be stored. Anaesthetic equipment and training were all very basic. X-ray machines were very rarely available. And the army didn't even have motor ambulances. So all they had at the start of the war were ambulances drawn by horses. So at first, the army officers and the doctors who came to see the novelty of this hospital staffed by women were almost uniformly hostile. But when they toured the hospital, spoke to the patients, and watched the women in the operating room, they were converted, and they became strong allies and advocates for the women's work. So 2 months later, in November 1914, Flora and Louisa opened a second hospital in another hotel, the Chateau Millicent, on the French coast. And this time, the army gave them official status. So the Chateau Millicent became the first hospital staffed by women to operate within the army. And then in early 1915, Murray and Anderson were invited to a meeting at the War Office in London with Sir Alfred Keogh, who was head of the Royal Army Medical Corps, so effectively the top doctor in the army. So Keogh had heard his army colleagues in France praise their work. He needed thousands more beds on the home front in London. But he was taking a gamble. It was an astonishing request. It was unprecedented, and they accepted immediately. They knew that this was their real chance to prove that women doctors were every bit as skilled as their male colleagues. So they closed their units in France and moved back to London. Well, Endell Street Military Hospital opened in May 1915 in a former workhouse in Covent Garden, just minutes from Trafalgar Square if you've been to London. It had 520 beds, that was later increased to 573 in 17 wards. All the wards were named after female saints. It was, and it would remain, the only hospital within the British Army to be run and staffed by women. Apart from 22 male army orderlies, and that number was later reduced to 8, all of its 180 staff were women. There were 14 doctors, so that was 14 doctors' posts. Altogether, there were about 40 different women doctors who worked there throughout the war, including surgeons, physicians, anaesthetists, radiologists, a pathologist, an ophthalmologist, and a dental surgeon. Flora Murray was the chief physician, and Louisa Garrett Anderson was the chief surgeon. There were 29 trained nurses, so not very many for 17 wards, and more than 80 orderlies. And in fact, it was the orderlies who did most of the work. So they were nursing assistants, stretcher bearers, cooks, cleaners, and clerks. And most of the orderlies were young, middle, or upper class women who'd previously led lives of leisure. Most of them had never boiled an egg before, let alone emptied a bedpan. Some of them were dropped off at the gates of Endell Street each morning in chauffeured cars. And in later years, in 1918, a unit of 20 women travelled from America, from Syracuse in New York, to work at Endell Street as orderlies. So they were known as the Hazard Unit, after their organiser, not because they were any risk. Their organiser was called Dora Sedgwick Hazard. And that's why quite a few of the photographs that I'm showing, and lots of photographs in the book, are from America. They're from Hyde Park, from the Roosevelt estate. But regardless of their background or nationality, all of the women wore the same Endell Street uniform. They were awarded army pay and allowances and given honorary military rank. So Murray and Anderson became the equivalents of majors, and Murray later was promoted to become lieutenant colonel. But they were not allowed official commissions or to wear army uniform or insignia. Well, Endell Street was on the front line of London's wartime medical care. Ultimately, there would be more than 300 hospitals of varying sizes in London receiving wounded soldiers. But Endell Street was one of the 20 largest military hospitals in London. And in central London, it was one of the biggest 10. And because of its proximity to major railway stations, it received the most serious cases. The convoys of wounded, like this one in the photograph, would arrive normally in the middle of the night, and the imminent arrival of a convoy would be announced by a bell ringing in the courtyard. And when they heard the bell, the orderlies would hurriedly get dressed. They lived on the hospital site, and then rush down to stand to attention in the courtyard. And then as many as 80 men at a time would be unloaded from the ambulances and taken up to the wards. So Endell Street was really regarded as a huge gamble. When Sir Alfred Keogh came up with his plan, he was warned by his colleagues that it was going to be a failure. Army chiefs predicted that it would not last 6 months. And in fact, the War Office put every obstacle in the women's way. They were as unhelpful as possible. And yet it not only survived 6 months, but it was hailed a triumph. To begin with, some of the wounded men who were brought there and unloaded from these ambulances in that courtyard were so shocked at being surrounded by women and treated by women doctors, they thought they had been sent there to die, because that was the only explanation they could think of to explain why they were going to a military hospital run by women. But very quickly, they accepted the women's staff. And then they were telling their friends and journalists that it was the best hospital in London. And newspapers responded likewise. Initially, the press really treated Endell Street as a curiosity. The early reports were often frivolous and incredulous, but this soon changed, and Endell Street was being held up as an emblem of the Blighty fighting spirit. The Suffragettes Hospital, as it was known, was described in headlines as the most popular and the most successful in London. Endell Street became renowned for its efficient organisation and professional care. Throughout the war, the staff treated more than 26,000 wounded, and the vast majority of those were men, but there were also about 2,000 women who worked in the services towards the end of the war. The doctors at Endell Street performed more than 7,000 major operations, many more minor operations, often operating between 8 and 9 hours a day. And they introduced pioneering treatments. They were at the forefront of championing X-rays and physiotherapy and occupational therapy, which were all novel specialties at the time. They also pioneered a new method of wound treatment. In 1916, Louisa Garrett Anderson and the Endell Street pathologist, Helen Chambers, tested a new antiseptic ointment to tackle the severely infected wounds they saw. The ointment was called bismuth iodoform paraffin paste, or BIP for short, thankfully. And they found that it not only healed wounds better than other antiseptics, but because it could be left in place for up to 10 days, it was much less painful for the men having to have dressings changed and less time consuming for the staff. And they first tested that in July 1916 on some of the first men who were coming back from the Somme. And they published the results in the Lancet magazine a few months later. But as well as being renowned for its professional medical treatment, Endell Street was famous for its homely atmosphere and its caring approach. Anderson believed that most of the men were more wounded in their minds than in their bodies. And so she insisted that the wards were all airy and bright with colourful bed quilts, standard lamps and fresh flowers every day. And the courtyard, which had been a very grim exercise yard in the old workhouse, was turned into a tranquil green haven with plants and striped umbrellas, where the men could relax or enjoy entertainments like this August bank holiday fete, where you can see children. The men were invited to ask their families along for such events. There was also a library with 5,000 books, which was run by 2 women authors. One of them was the American author and actress Elizabeth Robbins, and a theatre which staged hundreds of entertainments, including concerts and magic acts and pantomimes. More than 1,000 entertainers visited the hospital every year. And the men were also taught knitting and needlework to keep their hands and their minds occupied. Some of it still survives. This shoe bag on the left is believed to show Louisa Garrett Anderson walking her 2 dogs. It's in the Anderson family still. And on the right, this dovecot was embroidered. There's a little notice on the back which says it was embroidered by Walter Elmy, having had his arm amputated. So he sewed that with one arm. But despite all the efforts at jollity and keeping people busy, it was, of course, grueling and exhausting work. On top of the long hours, the women came under attack from air raids, from Zeppelins and planes dropping bombs on London. Some of those bombs fell very close to the hospital. And as the war went on, they suffered from food shortages and rationing was introduced. And in addition, Murray and Anderson were very strict disciplinarians, very hard taskmasters. And of course, they had to be in order to run an efficient military hospital. But many of the staff talked of being in awe of them, and many of them were actually really afraid of these 2 women. One of the orderlies said they had been told they had to be not only as good as men, but better. And yet, although it was obviously grueling, it was exhilarating work too, because the women were enjoying the chance for the first time to do something they were really good at, working together for a common cause, proving they could do anything that a man could do. Well, after the war ended, Endell Street stayed open for another year to treat the victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. And that was the darkest time for the staff, as you might be able to imagine. Throughout the war, the women had saved thousands of men from death and disability, but they were no match for this invisible enemy, the flu virus. The pandemic caused between 50 million and 100 million deaths worldwide. And at the height of the second, the most lethal wave, which arrived in Britain in November 1918, the time of the armistice, nearly 30,000 people died in a single week, just in Britain. And at Endell Street, more patients died per week of the flu than had died per week in the war. And of course, it affected the staff too. 22 of the staff fell ill with the flu, and at least 4 of them died. So at one point, Flora Murray, who had remained utterly steadfast, strong throughout the whole war, she broke down in tears. But Endell Street still trialled new methods to prevent the virus spreading, including the use of face masks, segregating the wards, and screening the beds. So the doors of Endell Street finally closed in December 1919. And the war had changed everything and nothing. Women in Britain had won the vote in 1918. Women over 30 were allowed to vote. The women at Endell Street had proved that women could run a military hospital just as well as men, that women doctors, women surgeons were at least as skilled as their male counterparts. And yet now the women doctors, all of the hospital's women staff, were expected to go back to doing exactly the roles they had done before. Medical schools, which had only stayed open during the war by enrolling female students, now closed their doors to women. Mainstream hospitals, many of which had also only survived in the war, only able to provide a service because women doctors did those jobs, they now dismissed those women and they refused to appoint women doctors again. And so most of the women who had worked at Endell Street had to go back to treating only women and children, or work abroad, or retire. And it was going to be many more decades before women in medicine won equality in law, at least. I'm sure most doctors would agree there's still a long way to go yet. So Flora and Louisa continued working in medicine for a few more years. And then their children's hospital closed for lack of funds, and they retired to the countryside. Flora died in 1923. I think she was really worn out and worn down by all her war work. And she had a military funeral with the last post being played. And then Louisa lived on alone for another 20 years. She worked in a casualty department in the Second World War before she died in 1943. And at that point, her name was added to Flora Murray's gravestone. So Louisa had been cremated and her ashes scattered, but her name was then inscribed on Flora's gravestone. And despite everything they've been through, despite all of their trials and all their battles, the inscription says, "We have been gloriously happy." That always kind of brings a bit of a tear to my eye. So I wrote my book as a tribute to all the women who worked at Endell Street, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies, and all the men who were treated there. I wrote it to give voice to them, but also because I think it speaks to us today, and especially today, even though I had no idea it would become quite so relevant when I wrote the book. But it speaks to us about the extremes of human endurance, of loss and pain and sacrifice, but also courage and dedication and compassion, and the simple joy of being alive. So thank you, all of you, for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I'm very happy to answer your questions. But of course, there's lots more information in the book, and I hope you will support Eight Cousins Bookshop as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. It was fabulous. I was writing down questions which you wound up answering all in the talk. But how was Endell Street supported by the government, by the military? Was it funded through them, or how did they maintain their existence?
Well, because it was officially working within the British Army in a kind of strange hybrid situation, the hospital was funded by the British Army. So they had all their supplies from the army. They had to fill out masses of army paperwork which drove them around the bend. The hospital itself was fitted out by the army, and the only reason they had patients coming was because the army approved it. So officially, they were all in the army. But even despite that, there was still a lot of people high up who didn't support them and really thought they were going to fail, and they didn't want to be part of that failure. So some of the top officials within the army kind of kept a distance from them, even though they were very much supported by Sir Alfred Keogh, who was the top doctor in the army. And at the end, he came to visit the hospital and he said to Louisa, "I knew you could do it." So that was, it approved his faith in them.
You've got credentialed doctors who are looking for work, looking to help. They make, so all these obstacles are put in their way. That they've been educated overseas, so somehow that becomes a roadblock, an impediment. That other institutions in the UK provide doctors, and yet, besides Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson, what becomes of the other doctors? Do they? I mean, as you said, in the 1920s, now things they change and they don't change at all. Are some of the other women doctors able to find work and move forward the work that Endell Street provided?
Well, they did find work. Most of them carried on in medicine. In fact, so there were about 40 women doctors who worked there. Some of them came from overseas. 5 of the surgeons came from Australia, so they travelled specifically to London to work at Endell Street. One other doctor was from Canada, so she worked there as an anaesthetist. But whether or not they came from overseas or from within Britain, they all faced the same problems afterwards. They went back to the women who went back to Australia. They were told they couldn't have jobs in the main hospitals. The same for the woman who went back to Canada and the women in Britain. So the mainstream general hospitals, the big hospitals, which treated men and women, mostly did not allow women doctors to work there. So they sacked the women who'd been working there in the war. And so most of the women doctors, they went back to working in hospitals that only treated women and children, that were run by women. The main one in London was the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital. Or a lot of them got jobs in checking school health and working in public health, which were all very much considered lower jobs. But even then, if they got married, they had to give up their job. So there was a marriage bar, and a lot of women doctors didn't get married because if they did, that was the death knell of their careers. Other women doctors went abroad to work in missionary developments, and some retired. So there were, I think there was one doctor from Endell Street who did go on to have an illustrious career, who was the pathologist, and she worked in pioneering work in cancer. But for the most part, all that experience that they had gained was wasted.
How much objection was there? I'm sure it happened daily, weekly, monthly, but how much objection was there to soldiers who had been sent from the battlefield and now they're being treated by women? Was there this chauvinistic, misogynistic ism that they had to overcome, and how often did that happen?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because that was one of the Army's initial objections. They thought that men would not accept being treated by women doctors. And indeed, that was one of the main objections to women doctors working in mainstream hospitals. Their own medical profession said male patients would not accept being treated by women. But in fact, that didn't happen at all. At Endell Street, there was one case where a soldier arrived there and said he changed his mind. He didn't want to be treated by women doctors. So they were going to send him to another doctor, to another hospital. And then he changed his mind again, and he wrote and asked his mother to ask them if he could come back. So that was the only case. But I think what's quite interesting is there's as well as a gender question, there's a class element as well, because most of the patients, most of the soldiers were ordinary Tommies, as they were called in the army. They were not officers. And the women who worked there, most of the women doctors, were upper class or middle class. So I think that made a big difference, that the men basically looked up to the women in a sense, and had confidence in them because the women were better educated, and sort of spoke in a posh voice and sounded authoritative. So they accepted the women. It was very remarkable, and took pride in the hospital as well.
If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. You mentioned at the end, the last year was dealing with the Spanish flu, and so that was probably the darkest days. How many patients did they take on? What was the recovery rate or success rate? Because obviously that was pretty daunting at the time, and then and now. So how well did they fare?
I can't recall the actual mortality figures, and they're only quite vague. This was the end of 1918 and the early 1919. So the second wave was the most lethal to hit Britain. But in fact, for some reason at Endell Street, it was the third wave, which arrived in the spring of 1919, that was worse for the hospital. So there was something like 20 soldiers died in a month, from my recollection. There were certainly more men who died during that time in the hospital of the flu than had died of their wounds in the hospital. And they were also treating not only soldiers coming back, at the end of the war and coming there, but also local civilians also came into the hospital at that point with the flu. And quite a lot of the women who were working in services were brought there. So there's a really tragic case of a woman who was working for the British Army driving armoured cars and she fell ill. She was taken to Endell Street and she died just before the armistice was announced, and her funeral was held on the 11th of November, so the day the war ended. And that week was one of the worst weeks. That's when most people died in Britain of the flu. And at Endell Street, the peace was being celebrated, but they were really hard at work trying to save people from the flu, for which there was really there really wasn't much they could do. There were no antibiotics, so it was a question of giving them fluids, keeping them fed, keeping them cool, and really hoping for the best. I think that was the worst thing. They didn't really have any effective treatments.
Leon, you have a question?
Yes, I'm just curious, were military pensions available at that time? And if so, were the women eligible for that?
Military pensions. Well, military pensions were just being brought in during the war. So the men who were severely wounded, they were entitled to pensions of varying amounts according to their injuries. The women didn't get pensions, as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure they weren't being paid army pay. They were being paid at the same rate as the army. So it was like an honorary role and honorary pay. So they didn't actually get pensions. And in fact, as a result of Endell Street, because that was held up as an example of how women doctors could work in the war, the army then took on more women doctors, about 80 more women doctors, and they went out to work in Malta and Egypt. And they had similar treatment. So they were not allowed to wear army uniform. They were not given army rank. They were not even allowed to travel in the same carriages as the male officers. So they had a really hard time because they were trying to prescribe and give their medical diagnoses, but often they were being undermined by army staff who were at a much lower grade than them. So there were lots of complaints. So it was definitely not smooth running. And Louisa, Garrett Anderson and Flora Murray actively campaigned for the other women doctors so that they would get equal pay and equal allowances, and to give them rank and to give them uniform. But some of those aims they didn't achieve.
Thank you.
How did the public view Endell Street, and how did other hospitals view Endell Street?
Well, I mean, I think it's I think the main way to judge is how the press responded. I know it's not exactly the same, but the response of the press was that it was quite sort of comical at first. They did kind of, you know, jokey articles about the hospital manned by women was one of the particular headlines. But then they did start to take them seriously. So I think it took a bit of time. It took a bit of time. It took about, you know, a year to bed in, and then they were being then treated, accepted basically, as part of the army. They, you know, proved that they were efficient and that they were good at what they did. And they had lots of support from the public. You know, public raised money for them. They had lots of visitors. So the royal family visited several times. They had visitors who were celebrities of the era, who were actors and writers and singers and so on. So it was you know, it was very well known in London. It was probably one of the most well-known hospitals in London. So, you know, very popular. As far as other hospitals go, I haven't come across that many mentions of it, but you know, essentially it was, when I first started writing the book and researching it, I thought maybe it was quite a small hospital and perhaps it only had convalescent patients or, you know, lesser wounded patients. But that was not the case at all. It was one of the biggest 10 military hospitals in the centre of London. So they did have other doctors actually coming to visit them and learn from what they were doing quite often. So there were one of the famous surgeons came to watch Louisa Garrett Anderson perform brain surgery at one point. So, you know, they were accepted. Their own medical profession had to accept them, even though after the war they wanted their jobs back, quite understandably. Really, the men wanted their jobs back, and so the women lost their jobs, unfortunately.
Is the hospital still standing today, or has that been torn down, or is that?
Yeah, another really interesting question. That no, there's nothing left of it. So after the hospital closed, it was taken over as kind of government offices for a while, and then the building was completely demolished in the 1970s. And so now on the site there are some council flats. And all there is a little plaque which commemorates the hospital. But inside, these flats are arranged around a courtyard, and that is the same courtyard that I showed in the pictures, where the ambulances would come in and where the men would have entertainments. So I managed to go in there and stand in this courtyard and, you know, try to visualize these ambulances coming in. So some of the trees are still the original trees, which is quite remarkable. But so there's nothing to visit, which is sad in one way, but at the same time, that I think that's how I got to, that's why the story has been forgotten. So in a sense, that's why I got to write the book and tell the story that's been lost, really.
Do you know if that wonderful story is imparted to present-day medical students in the UK in any form, shape?
Yeah, well, no, not routinely at all. No. I mean, mine is the first book about Endell Street. There have been a few articles. So no, most of the medical profession in Britain don't know anything about it.
You may have just answered my question. I was going to say, besides your book, is there anything to commemorate besides their shared gravesite for Flora Murray and Louisa Anderson? Is there anything to commemorate them at all other than a shared tomb?
Well, there is this plaque on the wall in Endell Street. So if anyone ever gets a chance to go to London, right in the very centre of London, in Covent Garden, at the top of Endell Street, there's a plaque on the wall, and it has suffragette colours. In addition, Louisa's name is commemorated on, there's a new statue to commemorate Millicent Faucet, who was the leader of one of the suffragists. Millicent Faucet was actually Louisa Garrett Anderson's aunt. And so there are names of about 30 women suffragettes, and Louisa Garrett Anderson is commemorated there. But in the main, yeah, they're not known at all. They have been pretty much forgotten, sadly. I think it's a huge shame. And after the war, Flora Murray wrote a book about what they did. And during the war, they collected newspaper articles and had photographs taken, because they really wanted to show what they'd done, and for that to be a testament to what they'd done. So Flora's book was her saying how they'd done it, and you know, how this was proof, basically, that women doctors could do anything that men could do. After the war, there was a real backlash against women. I think the men really wanted everything to go back to how it was before. They wanted to turn the clocks back. They wanted to really forget about the war. So there was quite a unpleasant backlash against women, any women particularly, who tried to assert their independence. And so, yeah, things went backwards, sadly, after the war.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today for doing this. This has been fabulous. You knocked this one out of the park. So I really appreciate the fact of you writing this book, taking the time to research it. How long did it take you to research this? From the time you began to finish?
Well, it took about 3 years in all, I think, in terms of research and writing. There's a lot of material. Luckily, there's a lot of material kept in the Women's Library in London, and I also managed to find lots of families of women who'd worked there, so whose grandmothers and great aunts had worked there, and also families of men who'd been treated there. So that was absolutely fantastic. And then just after I'd finished writing the book, I managed to get to Hyde Park, to the Roosevelt estate, where they've got an amazing picture album, which was collected by 2 of the women who came from America to work at Endell Street. So that was fabulous. But yes, it was, it was a great journey. I've absolutely loved researching and writing it. It was brilliant.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this. Great continued success with this book. When you come visit your relatives, make sure you come visit us. And
I definitely will.
And thank you so much for taking the time today. Everybody, thanks for taking the time, and stay safe, everyone. And again, thank you and good luck.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and lovely to see you briefly.